What if pain wasn't just a byproduct of war, but a form of entertainment? It sounds impossible, but between 1933 and 1945, in over 44,000 concentration camps and ghettos across Nazi-occupied Europe, that impossibility became reality. Inside Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen, prisoners weren't just starved or worked to death. They were forced to perform, to sing while bodies were burned, to play violin while children were led to gas chambers, to act in SS-approved comedies scripted by monsters, to box until one collapsed, not for survival, but for amusement. There were orchestras in Auschwitz, theaters in Buchenwald, brothels in Mauthausen, marching songs in Sachsenhausen, sung through bloodied lips and shattered teeth. But this wasn't culture. This was cruelty, choreographed, a stage where domination was the script and suffering was the show. The Nazis didn't just kill with bullets or gas. They killed with applause, because even music, humanity's last refuge, was corrupted. Its rhythm was used to control, its melody weaponized to drown the screams. This isn't just a story of genocide. It's a story of ritualized humiliation, of how joy, art, laughter, music was twisted into a tool of terror. In the camps, they didn't just murder the body, they murdered meaning itself. And in the end, they didn't just kill, they smiled. Welcome to History Unraveled, where we don't just tell stories, we uncover the darkest layers of the past. Let's begin. Before the whip cracked, the laughter came. In the Nazi concentration camps, cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was choreographed. The SS didn't simply punish, they turned pain into ritual, discipline into spectacle. And for many it became a form of amusement. At Auschwitz, prisoners stood motionless for hours during roll call, through snow, mud, blistering heat. When one collapsed, guards didn't help. They laughed. Sometimes they nudged him with their boots to wake him. Sometimes they forced others to hold the person upright. A man was no longer a man. He was a warning, a prop. At Buchenwald, a prisoner was forced to crawl on all fours, mimicking an animal while guards jeered and joked about how long he'd last. Another was ordered to sing a cheerful tune to the man responsible for her husband's death. This wasn't random cruelty. It was staged degradation, designed not only to control, but to entertain. After months of overseeing suffering, many guards became desensitized. Routine punishment stopped having an effect. So they sought new stimulation through mockery, humiliation, and games of power. And as cruelty became performance, prisoners became unwilling actors in their own degradation. The SS didn't hide this behavior. It was institutional. Himmler's system emphasized discipline and obedience, and camp commanders were given wide authority to maintain order. Public beatings, forced acts, and mental torment weren't just tolerated. They became routine. Guards created their own punishments. They ordered prisoners to hit each other, crawl through the dirt, or clean boots with their tongues. Sometimes they made a man strip and dance, only to punish him afterward. New SS recruits were trained not to view prisoners as people, but as objects, units, or inferior. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a process of dehumanization, one that allowed the guards to mock, mistreat, and even laugh without remorse. What survivors remember most wasn't the suffering. It was the laughter, the smirks after a slap, the clapping when someone collapsed. The guard who sang along as a prisoner whispered a lullaby through trembling lips. Some prisoners learned to play along, to sing on command, to kneel when cued. For a few, performance became survival, but it came at a cost. Each song, each motion, chipped away at the core of who they were. Others resisted. Not with fists, that would have been suicide, but with silence, a clenched jaw, a blank stare, a refusal to appear broken. Even those small acts were dangerous. In a world where the SS wrote the script, refusing your role could mean disappearance. This phenomenon has a name now. Historians call it the beast syndrome, not because the guards were inhuman, but because they chose to set empathy aside. And in doing so, they uncovered something terrifying, that power can feel good. And when reinforced through routine performance, it can even feel satisfying. One survivor later wrote, "The worst part wasn't the pain. It was knowing someone found joy in delivering it." The guards didn't become callous overnight. The system trained them, taught them to view cruelty as duty, coercion as structure, and performance as a tool of control. But not all the shows were created by the guards. Some were even more disturbing. In some camps they built boxing rings, not for sport, not for health, but for spectacle. Because when suffering becomes routine, survival itself becomes the next form of amusement. In Auschwitz, victory bought you a few days of life. Defeat could mean death by applause. One of the most chilling forms of entertainment in the camps came in the form of boxing matches. These were not sports, not competitions, but raw, controlled violence, staged to amuse SS guards, break the spirit of prisoners, and reinforce the brutal hierarchy of power. Victor Young Perez, a Jewish Tunisian boxing champion, was deported to Auschwitz in 1943. The guards recognized him. They gave him slightly better rations and ordered him to fight. His opponents, other inmates, sometimes guards, always malnourished, always terrified. Each win earned him a few more days, but it didn't mean he was safe. The SS placed bets. They laughed. They watched a former world champion stumble and bleed in the dust. And Perez wasn't alone. In Mauthausen, Paulino Uzkudun, a Spanish Republican and former heavyweight contender, became a Sunday ritual. Fights were scheduled routinely. Officers nicknamed him the camp's main event. Losing a match could bring severe punishment. Refusing to fight wasn't even an option. The ring was symbolic, often just a square of mud or a roped-off patch between buildings. The fighters were skeletal, many sick or injured. But the guards didn't care about technique or fairness. They wanted spectacle, hits, falls, collapse. Tadeusz Pietrzykowski, a Polish boxer and former champion, fought in over 40 matches in Auschwitz. He defeated men far larger than himself, including SS guards, not for pride, not for the crowd, but because losing might have meant disappearing. These matches weren't just about fighting, they were about power. They reminded every prisoner watching, your strength won't save you. Even legends can be broken. And in this place, even the struggle to survive could be turned into a show. There were no cheers from fellow prisoners, just silence and fear. Some were forced to watch. Others stared at the ground, praying not to be noticed. In the end, boxing in the camps wasn't about sport. It was a performance of dominance, a way to strip away the last fragments of dignity, one blow at a time. They played Bach while the smoke rose from the chimneys. In Auschwitz, even the cries had a soundtrack. Twice a day, prisoners marched to labor, their bodies skeletal, their feet frostbitten, and always the same music. A prisoner orchestra, composed mostly of Jewish musicians, stood near the gates, ordered to play cheerful marches while others trudged past. Many wouldn't return, but the melody never missed a beat. The music wasn't comfort, it was command. It said, keep walking, keep quiet, stay in line. At Birkenau, the Nazis assembled one of the most infamous orchestras of all. An all-female ensemble led by Alma Rosé, a celebrated Jewish violinist. Under her direction, dozens of women performed daily for the SS. Arrivals, selections, even public punishment, all were set to music. One survivor later recalled, they played Schubert, as the chimneys smoked. The women weren't allowed to cry. They had to play with precision, even as people passed on their way to the gas chambers. Those who performed well were kept alive. Those who missed a note faced punishment, or worse. In Buchenwald, there were regular concerts, not in secret, but on stage for SS officers. Prisoners dressed in borrowed suits. They played instruments taken from those no longer alive. The audience clapped, then returned to their duties. At Sachsenhausen, music became a form of control. Loudspeakers blasted Wagner and Nazi anthems across the camp. Prisoners were forced to sing at roll call, others during beatings. The melodies didn't soften anything. They amplified control. Alexander Kulisiewicz, a Polish inmate, memorized over 500 camp songs. He sang to survive. He later called the music the poetry of pain. Not all music was forced. Sometimes late at night a prisoner might hum, a lullaby, a folk tune, a memory, a final echo of the world they once knew. But even that was risky, because in these camps, beauty could be used against you. A violin wasn't an escape, it was a leash. To beat an SS guard in chess was to risk your teeth. Some battles weren't fought with fists or firepower. They were fought in silence, on makeshift boards, with trembling hands and tired eyes. In a world ruled by brute force, even intelligence was dangerous. The Nazis didn't just fear weapons, they feared ideas, strategy, awareness, and so they sought to dominate even thought. Chess, cards, tarot. In the camps, these weren't games. They were theater, psychological, brutal, and often fatal. In Auschwitz and Buchenwald, chessboards were carved from scraps of wood, bits of bone. Professors played silently. Some against SS guards, but to win was dangerous. One survivor remembered defeating a guard. The man smiled, then struck him across the face with his weapon. The message? You're not allowed to be smarter, not allowed to win. But losing was risky, too obvious, and the guards grew suspicious. These weren't games of chance, they were traps. Tarot readings were also used. The SS had a strange fascination with the occult. Some prisoners, Romani, mystics, or simply those desperate to survive, were forced to tell fortunes. A wrong answer, you might vanish. A flattering one, maybe a piece of bread. A Hungarian inmate remembered telling a young officer, "You'll rise in rank." He was given chocolate. He lived one more week. At Theresienstadt, a camp used for Red Cross propaganda, prisoners played staged chess for the cameras. Everything looked orderly, dignified. After the visit ended, the boards were taken away. A French prisoner once scratched a chessboard into his cell wall. "I'm beating Hitler," he whispered to himself. The guards found him and beat him unconscious. But in that moment, he believed it. Because even in the darkest place imaginable, the human mind can dream of victory. And in that dream, he wasn't a prisoner. He was a king. If only for one last move. The ball rolled, but so did bodies. In the camps, even football became a tool, not of sport, not of joy, but of control. On certain Sundays, guards organized matches, not as a reward, but as a performance for their own amusement. The field was often just a patch of mud. The ball, a bundle of rags. The rules, arbitrary. The goal, simply survive the game. At Auschwitz, prisoners were ordered to play in front of SS officers. One wrong move could cost a meal or worse. The crowd clapped, not out of support, but out of fear. Those who stayed silent risked punishment. Julius Hirsch, a renowned Jewish footballer who once played for Germany's national team, was told to play. He collapsed on the field. He was removed and never returned. In Mauthausen, a Spanish prisoner named Saturnino Navazzo used football to survive. His skills earned him a less dangerous job in the kitchen. He used that position to help others, even taking in an orphan child. Matches were sometimes organized by trade, carpenters against mechanics, cooks against clerks. But the SS dictated everything, and often changed the rules mid-game. There was no fairness, no sportsmanship. One Soviet team played too well. The entire group was punished afterward. For winning. Sometimes guards joined in, not to play, but to mock. They kicked prisoners instead of the ball, laughed at their injuries, turned the match into a stage for domination. For the players, football brought fleeting moments of memory, a pass, a shared glance, the echo of a life they used to live. But it also brought danger. Visibility meant exposure, and exposure often came with consequences. To the prisoners, football felt like dignity. But it was illusion. It was another performance, another method to show who held the power. Because in the camps, even the joy of the game was drowned out by boots, whistles, and silence. In Mauthausen, intimacy was currency, and the price was your soul. This wasn't about desire. It was about control. Inside Nazi concentration camps, the human body itself was transformed into a system of transaction, where power, fear, and survival replaced any notion of choice. Camp brothels weren't rumors. They were sanctioned. In Mauthausen, Dachau, and Buchenwald, special barracks, known as Sonderbauten, were constructed under official orders. Women, many lured by false promises of better treatment or early release, found themselves trapped in a place of coercion. They were assigned to serve high-ranking guards, then capos, and eventually even selected prisoners, those who had been deemed compliant or useful. Some were musicians. Others worked in kitchens or maintained camp machinery. They, too, were victims of a system that exchanged humanity for obedience. In Gusen, dozens of women were reportedly made to endure this every day. They were inspected, lined up, used. The silence became a survival tactic. Resistance was rarely an option. Outside, the orchestra played classical waltzes. For the SS, it was just another perk. For the women inside, each note marked another moment of despair. Eligibility was strictly controlled. Only non-Jewish, non-Soviet women were selected. But once inside, identity no longer mattered. One survivor later said, "I forgot my name. I remembered my bed number." Some became pregnant. Others were subjected to sterilization procedures. Most were discarded when deemed no longer fit for service. There were accounts even darker, of staged abuse masquerading as punishment. In some instances, prisoners were forced into humiliating situations before audiences. Control became spectacle. Even families of the SS participated at times, observing, directing, or turning a blind eye. One woman recalled, "They didn't need to lay a hand on me to erase me. They just made me forget I ever had the right to say no." The aim wasn't just physical domination. It was psychological dismantling, an erasure of self-worth, of dignity. And when two prisoners showed simple acts of kindness, a glance, a held hand, a whispered word, it was treated as rebellion. Because in a system designed to crush empathy, affection became resistance. Some survived. Others buried their stories for decades. And a few found the courage to speak, not for attention, but to say this: "Don't look away," because in the camps, the destruction wasn't just of the body. It was the criminalization of connection itself. She looked like an angel, but she collected human skin. She had red curls, a soft smile, and a taste for expensive perfume. To the outside world, she might have seemed like a schoolteacher, a refined German wife. But behind the barbed wire of Buchenwald, Ilse Koch was something far more sinister. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald. Some whispered worse. She was married to Karl Koch, the camp commandant. But Ilse made her own mark. She wasn't content to witness cruelty. She took part in it. She rode through the camp on horseback, whip in hand, dogs by her side. She'd smile as prisoners cowered. Her preferred victims? Those with tattoos, because she collected them. Testimonies revealed that Ilse had prisoners with interesting tattoos selected for execution, so their skin could be preserved. Turned into items, lampshades, book covers, gloves. Some called it myth, but the stories were consistent. American troops found preserved skin, and survivors remembered. One said, she walked like a queen through a graveyard. In their private villa, Ilse surrounded herself with mirrors and luxury. While prisoners starved, she hosted lavish parties in silk gowns. She wasn't just a bystander. She turned cruelty into theater. Even the SS eventually investigated. Karl was executed for corruption. Ilse was imprisoned, later released. Only after U.S. forces arrived was she finally brought to trial. At the Buchenwald proceedings in 1947, she denied everything, claimed the lampshades were made from animal leather. Few believed her. She was sentenced to life, then controversially released, retried after public outrage, and eventually died by suicide in 1967. But her story lingers, because Ilse Koch wasn't a monster in disguise. She was a woman who made suffering seem elegant, pain decorative. She was a reminder that evil can wear perfume and still smile. They played with children, not like humans, like toys. Children didn't belong in war, but in Nazi camps. They weren't just imprisoned. They were subjected to experiments, humiliation, and used for the guards' entertainment. Eva and Miriam Moses, twin sisters, were handed candy by Dr. Josef Mengele in Auschwitz. Then they were injected, studied, compared. One survived. Thousands did not. At Buchenwald, boys were used for shooting practice. In Majdanek, infants were thrown into the air and targeted. In Jasenovac, children were beaten to death. Some were starved, slowly. Others were punished for asking for food. One boy was told he would see his mother. She had already been taken to the gas chambers. Over 230,000 children were deported to Auschwitz. Fewer than 700 survived. Even the Red Cross was misled. Children were dressed up, given sweets, and paraded during inspections, then quietly returned to their fate. Some etched poems on the walls, others smiled for the last time. Most were never heard from again, because in the camps, childhood wasn't just lost. It was destroyed. Death art, turning bodies into objects. In the camps, cruelty didn't stop with death. It continued in what came after. To the Nazis, a prisoner's body was not sacred. It was material. Skin became collections. Bones became decoration. Tattoos became souvenirs. Behind locked doors, death was treated like craft work. Ilse Koch, yes, again, was among the most notorious. Known not just for brutality, but for collecting tattooed skin and having it turned into household items. American liberators found horrific evidence. Rooms filled with shrunken heads, stretched skin, and photo albums showing tattoos removed from bodies. Many of those tattoos had names, faces, stories. But to some in power, they were just canvas. Koch wasn't alone. Other SS officers kept ornaments made from bones. A surgeon named Erich Wagner reportedly helped preserve tattooed skin like it was art. It wasn't science. It wasn't medicine. It was cruelty, disguised as curiosity. Because in places like Buchenwald and Auschwitz, even in death, dignity was stripped away. Some victims weren't just killed. They were displayed, not to remember them, but to forget their humanity. Jasenovac versus Auschwitz, when evil was personal. Auschwitz is the most infamous death camp in history, a place where death was systematic, industrial, and coldly organized. But Jasenovac was different. operated not by Germans but by Croatian fascists known as the Ustaše. Jasenovac didn't rely on gas chambers or crematoria. It didn't need them. There, people were executed by hand, with knives, with clubs, with axes. One guard reportedly claimed to have ended over 1,300 lives in one night, and was rewarded with a bottle of liquor. Even SS officers who visited Jasenovac were disturbed by the brutality. At Auschwitz, death was efficient. At Jasenovac, it was theatrical. Children weren't just killed. They were used in gruesome games, thrown, beaten, tortured without reason or restraint. There were no rules, no limits, no illusions of order, just cruelty for the sake of it. That's why survivors described Jasenovac not as a camp, but as hell itself. And yet, few outside the Balkans even know its name. If you want us to uncover the horrors of Jasenovac and the terrifying stories buried there, tell us in the comments. Some truths are too dark to be forgotten.